Okay, what we're going to look at is we're going to look at some more settings that you don't usually get into, you don't usually look at, but they can save you a lot of time, and you just never know when you might need them. One of the first ones is, of course, your view menu. And, we went through the toolbars last time, right? With how to turn on and off your toolbars if they disappear. And, the navigator we'll cover later. These are your editing views. Okay, the ruler, you can measure, hide image, your needle penetrations is what I just showed you. And then you've got design information and view preferences. So we're going to go into view preferences first. Okay, on the preferences, you guys have probably all, been through these, and, you've got your autosave, which 5 minutes is fine. Don't decrease that because it's just trying to save it constantly then. It gets to the point where, hey, Shirley, how you doing? We just started.
I've been having trouble finding it on.
Oh, I wonder if it's an internet kind of thing. We're having good weather here, but I think those storms just kind of keep moving around. But anyway, we just started with going through the preference setting. And the place you can find that is in View. And let me go ahead and close it. We'll just kind of start over with View and then View Preferences. And these are the basic things. Auto save, you're just going to leave alone. This calibrates your screen. So if you have not calibrated your screen, then you need to do so. And, to calibrate the screen, you're basically going to, measure this, put a ruler up against it or a tape measure, and you're going to use these to adjust. See how that adjusts? Okay, and I'm going to cancel so that I don't have to recalibrate my screen.
So what do you have yours at?
Mine is, I've measured it, and you see how my squares, my grid is square?
Huh?
So I've measured whatever, the measurement was with the ruler, right? Like I hold my tape measure up against that little ruler, and then I use these arrows to adjust this so that it lines up. And you can see it's telling me it's in centimeters.
Okay.
And if I go over to inches, I can do the inch thing. But centimeters and millimeters are so much more accurate, right? Now, you can display in millimeters or in inches, and we do everything in millimeters because it's just a quicker setting for your sizes, because everything in your hoops and your grids are all in millimeters. Your stitch lengths and your densities, it's just a better setting in millimeters. So that's why I work in millimeters. You can change over to inches if you want, but I think you'll find it's not that you have to learn the metric system. It's just you'll get used to these settings, and they're much, much more logical. Okay, you can select your thread, catalog, and, this is the thread library you will automatically use now, right? Display the thread bar. Ignore group is something that we're going to cover later because it's a little complicated. And I don't have use thread library and image manipulation checked because sometimes those settings on those thread catalogs, which you get from the thread companies, aren't exactly right. And what happens is you have an image that has, a few shades of red, it might see them and it might not if you use the thread. Before you're dealing with 16 million potential colors with, Windows, right? Your thread catalog could be like 400. And sometimes that conversion will take pieces out of your design that you really did want to keep. Okay, auto-generate after punching. If you uncheck this, what happens is that you stay in wireframe until you hit generate. And sometimes this comes in handy. But for right now, for what we're doing, we're going to leave that checked. Okay, remove compensation in 3D view. That is, if you were in your 3D stitch view, in other programs, you end up seeing compensation. It can kind of throw you a little bit. It makes your design look kind of cartoony and fat, right? So you can remove your compensation here. It doesn't mean that it's there. It's just in the view. It doesn't show up in the view. Play shadow color, that's in one of the stitch previews, and we'll look at that in a little bit. I'm going to leave this at the default. And it says, do not show the image edit dialog box for all images supported by generations. Yeah, we're going to leave that checked. Okay, export 3 settings. when you click on that, since if you've upgraded, you all have Export 3 now, right? This is when you have older machines. You know, you can break the file if the color changes exceed 9. You know, this is coming from BuzzTools, which is what that export is. It's from BuzzTools, right? And these are for the older machines, or, you know, if you have a machine that's limited to the number of stitches and you make some giant design and your machine can only read 100,000 stitches, you're going to want to break that here at 100,000, you know? Okay? And you would tell it to break it on a color change, which would be better than breaking it in the middle of the color. Okay? Does that make sense to you guys?
Yes.
Okay, you probably won't have to use this, so I'm just going to cancel. Okay, hoop original point. Custom hoop. You can make your own custom hoop, you know, aspect ratio 1:1. That means that, you know, if I change this, it's going to change here, right? Here's your machine hoop types. And, you know, they've got quite a few hoops in here. You know, this is for the Generations machine. You know, but you can see here's the major brands, right? And Brother Baby Lock, if you can't find something in the Baby Lock, then just go to the Brother. It's a guarantee that it's there. So if you want to display your hoop, you can. You know, they even have like the newer hoops for, you know, the expressive, and you can see the options that are available. So, you know, at this point, you know, I'm just going to go ahead and go down to Janome, and we'll just pick a pretty standard hoop, okay? Horizontal or vertical? You know, I'm going to go ahead and leave it horizontal for right now. And the rest of these settings are generally like this. This is the default, right? You want to auto center on the design center. You can auto center also on the bottom center if you want to, which means that the bottom of your design will be centered, and you can offset this. We're not going to play with this right now. If for some reason you have some odd things going on with your hoops, this would be where you would check. At some point you might have maybe changed this. You can see here's my original point right here, right? Here's my max work area. It's 1,000 millimeters. Okay, my hoop center, these are a little bit off because I was actually in there playing at some point. So if I take off auto center, I can come here and I can set this to 500 and 500, which is what it should be. And my hoop center should be the same here, right? Okay, so I'm going to go back to auto center. Once I correct those, then my hoop will properly center now. Okay, now show original point. This is unchecked because when this was checked, what you had was this little thing right here. So you had the, you know, the beginning original point and the end point, which is that plus. And, you know, it got to be, you know, kind of annoying sometimes. Some people like it, but most people don't. So there's the option to turn that off. And even though I've selected a hoop, I would need to show my hoop in order for that to display here. And if you're really paranoid that you've changed something, then just load your factory settings and everything goes right back to where it was when you installed the program, okay? So here's my hoop. I've turned off the original point, right? And that's what I have on the screen. So now let's go into View Preferences again, and let's go over to Canvas Settings. Okay, my background color is yellow. My, you know, view color is gray. You know, this is going to be, you know, kind of the, I'm trying to think how to describe it. Like if you're stitching through kind of things, it's you know, like, we'll look at that one in a little bit. But anyway, here's my background color, it's yellow. Here's my grid color, and there's my, you know, grid line, right? I don't want to enable snap. I could say no grid, or I could say a dot grid if I don't like the lines on the screen, but the lines are usually easier to work with. Enable snap I would not use unless I wanted to, you know, maybe do something like a manually punch cross stitch or something, then I would snap to these little grid corners, right? My spacing is at 10 millimeters. This matches up to the grids that come with your machine hoops. Okay? So those are pretty much the same. Now, if I want to use a canvas color, then I can click on this and I can go in here and I can select any of the fabrics that are in here. And we'll go ahead and we'll select, should find a cotton. I guess we'll go with the gingham. And, you know, maybe I don't have green gingham. Maybe I have like red gingham, or I guess that's a little too red. There we go. It's got at least there we go, red gingham. Okay. You may want to add a little more blue to it. It's kind of pinkish actually, but see if I slide the blue over what happens. Not too yellow. Okay, so you can play with these settings and then you can save it as a new fabric. Okay? I'm just going to call it pink. Okay, so now it's going to be in my save settings. So I can automatically change whatever's in here and I can save that. I can also scan something directly into this. And we'll cover that as we go along, how to, you know, get your fabric in there. I generally don't use these, but sometimes, it's kind of nice to export a quick little picture with the fabric that you're going to do. And you can change the color on any one of these. When I take those to 0, you can see if I take them to the extreme side, you can see kind of what happens. And you really do have to kind of play with those to get what you want. Okay. So, and again, if you, are worried that you changed something, you could just, load the factory settings. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll go ahead and we'll just use the canvas, and I'll save this. Oops, sorry. I want to save as new. Okay, so now I've saved that bright cherry too, and I'm just going to kind of grab that real quick. Okay, so all it is a tiled effect, like a Windows screensaver. You can see the tiling because in Terry there would be no way to avoid that, right? But when we start to look at how to deal with our fabric, something like this. I guess I put the pink gingham somewhere. There we go. Something like this is a little easier to match up so that you don't notice that grid effect quite as much. Okay, see the difference between this and the terry? So we'll play with that. Obviously, like if you have a real psychedelic fabric, you're not going to be able to tile it very easily. You can get kind of an idea of what it looks like, but you're going to have to be careful. So, all right, so I'm going to go back and just go back to view preferences, and I'm going to go ahead and turn off the canvas. And we're back to just our regular, yellow screen. Okay, now, those are your view settings. There are some other settings that you should look at. One in, if you go to the stitch, these are just your basic settings. But if you go to accessories, you have what's called a default stitch setting. When you click on that, what that does is let you come in here and say, okay, on my complex fill, I would like complex edge underlay, and I want it to stitch first, and then I want the tatami underlay. And then I could come in here and I could say, change all of my settings here to, what I prefer, right? I could come in here and I can say, really I want to enable that standard and enable the cross and enable an overlap, and I'm going to explain what all of this means. This you're going to kind of ignore for the most part. enable standard means that this is your standard compensation. You can change this section by section, or if you find that you are constantly increasing this, you can change this in your default settings. We're not going to change anything right now. I just want to show you where these are. Enable cross, you know, this is for satin stitching. You know when you have like the letter E, you know where those little side pieces come in? You know, like that middle tine? Okay, enable cross is going to increase that compensation on that little middle prong on the E as it goes in to, you know, the main body of the letter E, you know, just to make sure there's no gapping. Like if I did lettering on terry towels, that little increase on that cross compensation would ensure that I had no gap and it didn't look like my little E was falling, and the little piece of the E fell off, right? Enable overlap. You know when you have like a complex filled area and it starts stitching in one corner and it goes so far and then it goes to the next corner and begins stitching and it meets somewhere where the two sides kind of join together, right? Well, what the program does is it creates lines that overlap each other there to make sure that there's no gapping because of, you know, fabric pull. And that's what that overlap means. Okay, we're going to leave these alone for right now. But, you know, I could change all of these settings for whatever stitch I have selected here, which is my complex fill. Then I could go over to the complex fill and say, you know, really, I don't like this pattern at all. I'm really sick of this being my default pattern, and hey, let's make this one the default, right? Then that would be what all of my complex fills were now created until I changed them. You know, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to save this so you can see what I'm talking about. Okay, so I've just changed the settings for the complex fill. I'm going to say OK. Now when I come over and I, you know, make a complex fill. And I'm going to pick a color. See the pattern? See that pattern I selected? Okay, when I change those settings, that's with complex fill. Now, AutoJudge is a different ballgame. Okay, AutoJudge is AutoJudge. Let me turn that off. Okay, and we'll change that so you can see it. AutoJudge is a separate setting. See how that stitch pattern is a little bit different than this one? Okay, does that make sense to you guys? You guys are very quiet.
I never understood what AutoJudge is. That
AutoJudge is technically a stitch type. Okay, it's not a complex fill, it's not a satin fill, it's a stitch type. And what AutoJudge does is it looks at something and it says, oh, it's big enough that it should be a complex fill, or it's small enough that it should be a column stitch or a satin stitch. And so, but technically, AutoJudge is a stitch type. Okay, this I changed to complex fill, but this is left at AutoJudge. Okay, there's my complex fill. Now, if I would come over here, because I changed that default setting, and say, oh, you know, make this a complex fill, I would get the same default pattern, see? Now, I'm going to go ahead and go back up to my accessories and my default stitch settings, because this is where you set the things that you want to happen for the most part, right? And in my complex fill, you know, I had changed my pattern. See, there's the pattern that you're seeing on the screen to be the default pattern, right? So if I say, you know, really, this one was doing okay for me, I'm going to go back to one set, you know, and I'm going to make that the default pattern now, okay? And I would say okay. then now if I came in here and I said, you know, make this a complex fill, see the pattern change? Because it's the new default. Does that make sense? Okay, so now in the default stitch settings, I just want you to know that they're there. But if you're going through these, remember, you know, I also changed the complex fill underlay, see? You know, if you make changes here, they're going to affect everything that you do. You can always change them to whatever you want, but they are going to affect everything that you do. So there's a load factory property here as well. So when I do this, anything that I've changed would be restored. But you should go and you should look at this. You know, if you find that you're doing, you know, if you find that you were doing, trying to get these to move up and down, and they don't really want to move up and down, but if you find that you're doing something constantly, if you're constantly changing your underlay, you're constantly changing something on a particular stitch pattern, then change it in your default properties and save yourself some time. Okay? I can do this for fills and I can do this for lines. You know, like for example, if you come into, you know, the blanket stitch line, right? If I come into this blanket stitch line and, you know, and I'm constantly changing this to 3, then change it to 3 in here. Does that make sense? Okay, so I wanted you to know that those were there. Now, we have some files that are in, we have some files that are, or some designs now that are, you know, in here. So I'm going to show you something else. There's view and there's view, you know, design information. The design information, if you were doing something, you know, here's your designer name, customer name, order number, you know, that's kind of, you know, for professional work, right? But, you know, there's some neat little things in here. Like if you come in here and you say maximum move length, okay? You don't want to change these all the time, but, you know, look at these because here's the maximum move length. What that is that's the jump length. Before, like if it's at 12.7, which is, you know, pretty decent jump length, right? So if I have like a section and, you know, the longest jump before a needle drops, before that machine drops its needle, is 12.7 millimeters. And then it drops the needle and places one stitch and will continue to jump if it's further than 12.7 millimeters. That's what that means, okay? The maximum move and the maximum jump length. The minimum move length is, you know, as small as you can possibly go here, right? High speed, this does not, you know, this is just for calculating time. This is not going to control anything on your machine. So it assumes that the home machines, even if they say they go 1,000 stitches per minute, really the average speeds end up being about 600 or 700, right? So that's what that means. It doesn't control your machine. It simply calculates time. Okay, stop, 60 seconds. So every stop you have, it figures you're going to take 60 seconds. Needle up, you know, it's kind of changing colors. It's timing things out here, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and say okay there. Thread colors, there's my 2 colors, right? Stitching time, that's how long that this would take to stitch because of the size of these, right? And this is my efficiency. Not that it really means a whole lot of things, but it's kind of interesting to see, and I want you to know that that was there. Okay, you could put notes in here, and you could save this. Okay? So just some quirky little things that are in the program that, you know, you can kind of take a look at. The design efficiency, you never really hit 100%. But you know, that'll tell you if you've got, you know, if you get a design efficiency rating of like 2% or 20%, you might want to take a look at whether or not you need to rearrange some things, okay? So does that make sense to you guys?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Here is the default global underlay setting. And how many of you guys know what global underlay is for? Okay.
Never used.
global underlay is used for a couple different things. One, you can use it if you're going to stitch on a heavy fabric or fleecy fabric or, you know, something with a high pile like terry cloth. And you can make a grid and flatten down the fibers or flatten down the area and basically build a foundation to put the embroidery on. Or if you have a very large design, global underlay can stabilize that particular area and attach it to your backing, and generally gives you better results. Okay, when you have global underlay, you can use the underlay that's in the design, but in most cases, you're going to turn it off. And global underlay is created in a separate step once you have a design. And you can do it for specific areas, you can do it for the whole design, but this is where you set your default settings, okay? In most cases, you know, you aren't going to want to use a grid. A grid's pretty hefty. You know, in most cases, you probably would not want a grid. Or if you do, you might want to change the density here. In most cases, you're going to use either a tatami or edge underlay. But, you know, this is where you could set your default underlay setting for this particular underlay. Okay, and then use a tie stitch. I would check use a tie stitch. And, you know, once you make these changes to this, you just simply say, okay. And now that's all saved, and you don't have to do it over and over and over again. So those are kind of the basic default settings. Okay, so let me go back, and I'm going to get rid of those, and we're going to start looking at a couple of other things. First, I'm going to go into the Create menu, and I'm going to go ahead and insert an image. And by the way, the Twain source is your scanner, and we'll look at that in a minute as well. Okay, so I'm going to insert my image, and these are just, you know, here's the default images that come with your program, right? And, you know, I'm going to go ahead and use this little Hip Pets bitmap here. Okay, it's telling me it's a scanned image, which means that there's probably a bunch of colors in here I really don't want. And remember I told you the scanned image thing is kind of a pain in the rear end sometimes, right? So we're going to lie to the program. We're going to tell it that it's simple artwork. And remember we did this auto select last time. This time we're going to go ahead and be control freaks and turn that off. And we're going to pick the colors. And when you look at this, you see one shade of blue, two shades of blue, a brown, and an orange, and a cream. That's pretty much it, right? So if I go to pick color, I can say, you know what, I want the blues, I want the brown, the orange, and that cream. Those are the only colors I see, and of course, you know, white, which is showing up with this other creamy kind of thing, right? So I'm going to go ahead and click on that and delete it and see what happens. So here's my colors that I'm seeing here, right? So when I go like that, and I say only, you know, 5 colors, right? I'm going to probably run into a problem unless I include that white. What it's going to do is probably view this and the white is the same, right? But when I lie to the program and say it's simple artwork and define my colors, I can kind of avoid that scanned image thing, right? Especially for something like this, it is pretty simple. So I'm going to go ahead and say, let's go ahead and insert this, and I'm going to make this 200. And, you know, this automatically defaults to the right size because I have that maintain aspect ratio checked. So we're going to say, okay, let's put this in there. And when I bring this in, my image kind of comes in faded. If I want to see the background image darker, I touch the plus key on my computer keyboard and generate because we brought this in as a simple image. So, you know, it did see these sections as the background color, and you know, we got a pretty decent auto-generated design here. There may be some things we need to fix, like these little eyeballs are, you know, seriously lacking, right? But, you know, and maybe these whiskers, you know, we could just manually punch those. But boom, we've got pretty much most of the design, right? The rest of it's just clean up. So I'm going to go ahead and, did not want to do that. Hold on, undo. I want to go ahead and pick out these little eyes right here. And I'm just going to hold the control key and delete it to get rid of it. And the same thing with, the little eyes here. And probably the little whiskers. These little whiskers are pretty sad looking. And I'm just holding the control key as I right click on these. And to delete them, I'm going to hold the control key and press delete, and they're gone. Okay, now I've got some holes here in, the little brown section that I really don't need. So I'm going to select this piece. And I'm going to go over to the View Outline, which is my editing tool. And I'm going to use a real quick option, which is called Fill Voids. And I have a choice to fill all voids, which is going to create a problem with the triangle nose, or fill a void. And if I select Fill a Void, I can come over here and I can move the mouse. And you see how it highlights pink when it's selected? I can fill these just by highlighting them and clicking on them. And that's all filled now. When I'm done, I just right-click to end that and regenerate the section. See? You guys have any questions so far? No questions? Okay, you guys are all good?
We're good. Yeah.
Okay. Now, when I want to do something like replace the eyes or, the whiskers, I'm going to start with the cat, and I'll go ahead and I'm going to, see the little eye that's on this film strip here? I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to hide it. And it still shows because I'm in 3D preview, so I have to turn off the 3D stitch view, and then I can see everything. So, what I'm going to do is just grab the quick tools. Here's my little circle. And I'm going to come over here and I'm just going to make a quick little circle. And press Escape. And I can left click on this circle and drag it into position. And then I can copy it. And I can paste it. And I can drag it over into position again. So there's, the two blue circles, and here they are right here. So I'm going to hold the control key and left click on both of them so they're both selected in the film strip. And I'm going to come up, see this orange section here. Well, there's an orange color chip here, and if I want to change those very quickly, I right click, or actually left click, and it, nope, sorry, I was right the first time. Select those and come up and right click on that color chip, and those change automatically. And then I can kind of just drag them up, underneath this. So, I've got the eyes made here, and I need to do the whiskers. So I'm going to select the running stitch. And over here is this double run. I'm going to come down here and I want to say, you know what, let's make this a triple run. And I can come over here and I can automatically change this, but I won't be able to necessarily pick the color I want. I'll get kind of close. Okay. Pre-close is off, and I'll explain what that is later. But now I'm just going to say, here's this. And if I want to avoid jumps, I'm going to change this a little bit so that, I come down here and I make a V. Press enter, and then I can bring this in and join it down here. And then press escape to, escape those. But here's my two line sections, and I am going to use the zoom tool to zoom in here and go into 3D view so you can see it a little bit better. Okay, now I want to stitch these as one piece. So what I'm going to do is go into View Outline. And it's easy, once you get used to this, you'll be able to come over here and click on it and select this. But if you have trouble clicking on these lines, you can always go up to outline and merge, okay? What that's going to do is that's going to make these all one piece. So when I merge them, I have to regenerate. What I have is I have something that's all one piece now. It makes it a little bit easier to deal with, right? It's going to stitch it. The program's going to change the in and out points. And since I manually punched these, the in and out points are not automatic. So I need to right-click on them and go to Properties and make sure that these are not checked. Okay, user define in and user define out. I don't want those checked, so make sure that they're not checked. All right, so now I'm just going to move these into place. So if I stitch this section first, I can left-click and hold this, and I can drag it into position up here, right? Or I can look at what number that cell is, and I can say, you know what, right-click, move to before index number 5. Boom, it's moved. Now, to change, since this orange is a little different than this orange, I can either right-click on that, or I can just remove the little color icon and make them the same orange. So now they're all the same. I have a cut symbol here because, of course, it's going to jump, right? But, I guess I would want it like that. Sorry. That, and then this eyeball. And see where my little jump lines are right now? Once I right-click and make sure nothing's flashing and regenerate, watch what happens to all of these lines here. They disappear, but, they also reorganize, like, my in and out points here so that it connects into this a little bit better, so that it connects into this a little better. Does that make sense? The program automatically moves those for me, unless I'm manually punching generally. Okay, so now I've got, I'm going to go back out of 3D because this is still, this section's still hidden, or it should be, unless I unhid it. Nope, it's still hidden. So I need to duplicate this. So I'm just going to left-click on the whiskers. And if you can't see them or you're having trouble, just grab them over here because you get the same effect. I can still copy, paste, right? Then I'm going to flip them and, drag them over here. And if I double left click on them, oops, sorry, double left click until you get this little, rotate thing. I want to move this pivot point down here and rotate those into place. And I might need to fine tune adjust, but there's my whiskers. This is what they look like. And I need to move them from the bottom here to maybe, right after the eyes. And regenerate to let everything recalculate those in and out points. When you want to recalculate the in and out points, make sure there's nothing flashing, because if you have anything selected, it's only going to calculate the in and out points for that particular item. So now we've got our cat looking a little bit better. We could fill in the hole here, which would make a little bit of a difference. And this is still hidden. So, if you hide things and you forget to unhide them, you can use, the view here and just click on the eye. You can see there's a red X, right? This is a simple design. If you have a more complicated design, you're going to select, all invisible areas and use the icon up here. Okay, so now everything's visible again. See? And, I've got a little bit better look to the cat now. His eyes are a little more rounded. His whiskers, aren't those big, bulky kind of things. But, the nose, it depends on what you want to do with the nose. I would check the direction of these areas, and they're both going the same way. So you might want to take that nose and change the direction of it. but you would probably get a better effect if you used your editing tools and said, you know what, let's just fill a void. And in this case, I can just fill all voids in there. And it's just going to look better, except it's going to be hidden under the brown. So, you know, you have a choice. You can either use the hole and stitch these blue sections at a different time. You know, like maybe, you know, move the blue sections down here. Does that make sense? You know, that actually works out kind of good as well, because, you know, I've got these brown sections. Here's my brown for the cat. Here's these brown sections. And, you know, it kind of works out better on some level if the brown's underneath that blue. But, you know, I can also move everything, by the way, by dragging these color chips into place. So there we go. Here's my cat. Here's the bird's beak. Here's the dog's ears. I might want to rearrange that to, you know, there's the bird's beak, the cat, and then the ears, right? But, you know, that'll work out. I can do, you know, the blue nose here and not cause too many issues. Now, I might cause some issues with the bird. Oh, sorry, because he has a brown eye. Or I could just stitch, you know, that little brown circle later. Or I could give him, you know, and the same thing with the dog. I'm going to run into some issues with the dog. Or I could choose to stitch that brown, you know, at a later time as well, right? When you come down to it, the cat really has more detail in the face than the dog or the bird does. The dog looks like he has more only because he has a different color there. But, you know, you probably are better off in this case stitching the brown eyes later. You know, those are three little things that don't take too much time. Just stitch them at the end. You guys have any questions so far?
Pretty straightforward.
I'm sorry?
I say it's pretty straightforward.
So, okay, so, you know, you guys understand the film strip. I know, Janet, you've used the film strip, right? Okay. Okay, there's some neat things in the film strip. I kind of went through them a little bit on the manual punch over here. But you can, like, you know, say you went over here and you moved this in and out point. And then you decided, well, you know, if it were a more complicated design, if you've moved a bunch of in and out points and it just has become very overwhelming to move any more in and out points, then, you know, don't do it. Just come over here and you can click by color if you want and select everything and right click and say properties. And, you know, I did the blue, so let me do the blue. Okay, when I move in and out points, it's a user-defined point now. And, you know, that means that when I generate the whole design, the program is not going to override my in or out points here. So you can either create them and leave it, or, you know, if you've moved a bunch of things and you decided that, well, maybe the program can rethink it for you, just remove those and say, okay, right-click off and regenerate. And that's going to redo all of your in and out points so that there's the least amount of jumps. Okay, now, with that being said, we did these pieces over here, right? And there's my out points. And then I go to this, and there's my in and out point, right? That is a very difficult trim for a consumer. You know, the shorter the distance, because the program has a logic, it's going to make it as short as possible, assuming that you have trimmers on a commercial machine. That's what it's assuming. But for a consumer, they have to get their scissors in there to trim that, right? So sometimes you're better off moving the out point here and controlling that so that you have, you know, like, there's my little jump there, right? When I recalculate this, I'm going to have, I have a trim, but if I turn that off, see where the jump goes now? That is an easier trim because it's longer. They can, you know, the consumer can catch it here and then catch it over here. So sometimes, you know, if you're creating designs that you're reselling, you're going to want to look at those jumps in that way. There's also another thing that you can do. I'm going to turn those off and regenerate these. There's a little manual punch tool that'll let you jump, and it would let you place a point, and that's an insert stitch tool. So if I'm here, you could create a jump. It's a little more complicated, but you could create a jump from there to there and stuff. But, you know, for the most part, just controlling where those in and out points are, you know, is a good thing to do. And I'm going to turn the trim on, but so you guys know, like these trims here work on a commercial machine. It's a commercial machine code. If you export in, you know, like, well, I'll just use the JEF format. Even though the, you know, most of the machines, the Brother machines, the Baby Lock machines, the Janami machines, the Alma machines, they all have thread trimmers now, right? The Viking machines, the FOF machines, but in theory, these little trims should kick my cutter on those machines now. In reality, they do not. You have to export in DST to keep those trims intact and then convert it into it, you know, through another program. The generations program does not keep those trims, just so you guys are aware. Does that make sense what I'm saying to you guys?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So those are kind of like the nuts and bolts. Right now, you know, I've got, you know, I won't go through the whole sequencing order, but, you know, we've got the blue because that's going to stitch, and then, you know, the brown. I would check my stitch directions. These are too awful close. I would angle these a little more. And the reason is that you want to kind of almost collide these areas. If I had these going the same direction, okay, see this is the stitch direction here, right? Okay, my compensation is going to add stitches here, it's going to add stitches here. So these areas will be covered well when they stitch, right? This is going to add some compensation here and here. So that should fill in okay. I mean, you know, you will want to change a little bit more, but you're kind of colliding. See the direction that the stitches are going? These are going this direction, these are going this direction. And by the way, see that little line right there? That's where that overlap compensation setting that we looked at comes in. So, you know, just check your stitch directions. You want to make sure that things are going, you know, in different directions so that you don't have a problem with gapping. Because even if you set your compensation, if your stitch directions are not, you know, reasonably correct, you're going to gap. Okay, now, I didn't generate this background section here, so I can right-click on it, Control-Delete, and get rid of it. But these sections here, we need to generate. And I can just right-click on them, and I might want to reshape this a little bit. Let me zoom in. See where that is, that little funny piece? I might want to reshape that. But for right now, I'm just going to say, okay, just make those sections. So there's my cream-colored sections. I would want those probably to stitch, you know, first or second anyway. You know, or before the brown, definitely. But I would still probably correct this. So I'm going to select that orange piece, and I'm just going to kind of zoom in right here. And this I can correct probably with a node. I can get rid of this node, just, you know, left-click on it and delete. I can left-click and grab that node there. And I can right-click on the middle of that line and straighten it out. So that corrected the orange. To quickly correct this piece, I'm going to go to Edit, right-click on the area, and we're just going to, what's the quickest way to do it? We could edit the outline mode. I guess we'll just go ahead and edit the outline mode real quick, because it's a real quick fix too. I'm going to right-click and, well, didn't want to do that. Hold on. I wanted to delete. You know, just right-click and delete, and right-click and, you know, I don't want to smooth. I would want to pull that one up. As you see my outline changing when I pull that out. See? Anytime I move that, right? So the quickest way with this would probably be to go ahead and right-click on the area and say, you know what, let's, you know, adjust this with a line. Or even quicker, I could create a void using the existing area and not worry about the nodes at all. So if I, you know, use this area, the orange area, right? See how it highlights? And I just select it and left click. See how it cleaned that whole area up for me, right? And the reason, you know, it's better is, you know, creating that void is generally better because if I move an outline, like when I was moving this piece here, you know, this, you know, little white section, anytime I move, the chances are that the rest of this outline is going to move as well, which would probably cause some problems over here. Okay, so now I've got that adjusted. I'm going to go right-click off to the side so nothing's selected and generate, and that area is filled in pretty nicely. Any questions so far? Shirley, is this making sense to you?
I have
Shirley?
a question from way back. You did something on the with the color chips to merge some colors with something, and I didn't catch it. You
okay.
Two colors and you merged them.
Yeah, there's there's a couple of things that I've done with the color chips. This little strip over here, there's a lot of functions to it. I'll make this like pink, right? Okay, so I have, you know, really this pink chip, and I want these orange pieces. I want them to all be the same color. And I can do a couple of things, like if I want them to be pink, I'm just going to come over here and see that little rainbow icon. If I click on the rainbow icon, it removes my color stop. So now they're all pink.
Okay.
Now,
I've used that before. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a real quick thing. Like, you know, when I went in and I auto-picked like the orange, it wasn't quite the same orange. Now, if I want this pink section to be orange, then I select the pink section and I right-click on that color chip, and it matches to the color chip I, you know, right-clicked on. So now everything's orange, right? If I wanted it to be like the darker blue, I could right-click on the blue as well. Okay?
Yeah, I had done that, but I'd never done that little color thing between the blocks.
Yeah, that little rainbow icon is just a real quick way to, you know, change something. It removes the color stuff. That's the best way of saying it. So, you know, like if I wanted, you know, if I accidentally clicked on this, for example, you know, the blue turns brown. If I want to change it, I just click on that, and then I can come over here and say, you know, let's pick a blue, and, you know, that's a little brighter blue than what I want. Or, of course, there's always the undo. And the undo, these little arrows here, lets me go back to, you know, a couple steps back, right? Or actually, I think up to 25. It might be 50. But that'll let me undo some things.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay. Shirley, any questions?
No.
Okay, so we've kind of covered some basics, and I do want to kind of go through the stitch settings. AutoJudge, when I said like AutoJudge is it's an actual stitch type, you have to really view AutoJudge as that, as a stitch type. Because setting-wise, AutoJudge has its own set of settings, okay? These are all like, this is an AutoJudge piece. It's big enough that it is a complex fill. These little eyes, they're AutoJudge, but they're small enough that they're going to be a satin stitch, right? So you have to, you know, kind of think as AutoJudge is its own stitch type with multiple sets of, settings, right? It is always a good idea to come in here and say, oh, you know what, I know that this piece, this piece, this piece, this piece, this piece, this piece, you know, you could select them all at once if you wanted to by holding your control key. Or as you work with each piece, come in and say, you know what, I really want it to be a complex fill. You know, it really should be a complex fill instead of AutoJudge. And the reason is that, let me kind of go back and undo. You look at this and you think, okay, it is a complex fill. If I resize this, when it's on AutoJudge, it may, become a satin stitch fill, whether I want it to or not. If I resize it small enough to become, size-wise, what the program would look at is small enough to be a satin stitch. So it's always a good idea to get in the habit of making sure that you have these fill types. Another reason is if you send it out to a machine, your machine, like if you send it out to a machine and you move it on your machine editing screen, and you have not really defined what that area is, you might find that the machine doesn't define it either, and you'll have, a gap in your design, because AutoJudge in this program is viewed as a stitch type, but on the machines, it really is not viewed as a stitch type. Okay, does that make sense? And I don't know if you guys have ever made a design in this program and put it on the machine and had, moved it on your editing screen on the machine and had things disappeared. But that's the reason. It has to do with that AutoJudge setting. And if you open it up in other programs, you'll see sometimes little odd pieces that are hanging off of an outlined area. You won't see the stitches, but the area is outlined very oddly, and it has to do with those settings. So it's a good idea to change your settings for each area. Like in this case, I'm still on AutoJudge, even though it's obviously a complex filled area, right? So I can either press my space bar, or I can use this little quick bar, but if I want a little more control, I would either press the space bar or click on this properties icon and, go in and say, I want this to be a complex fill, or, if you want to get fancy, you can use one of the other fills, right? Maybe you can use the arc fill and go in and change the settings to what you want, right? Use smooth edge on an arc fill is generally a good thing. Select a pattern if you want to. I'm going to go ahead and I'll just pick like this one set pattern. And on this arc fill, you might want to check these settings to make sure they're not too long. And let's apply it and let's see what happens. There's our arc. See how it's curving? If you don't like this pattern, go back in here and say, maybe this pattern's a better one. Apply it and see what it looks like. And say, okay, now the arc fill, if you guys have played with it, you know that this little dot controls how it arcs, right? See what that's showing, how it's arcing? The arc fill will also do some very strange things if you put this too close. See that line going across there? Yeah. It is really there. You don't want to get too close. You want to, be reasonable on this, or you want to change how things stitch here, right? But see the little funny piece up there? I might want to be very careful about where I put this anytime I use it and double check. Okay? But, you know, change the area to the stitch type that you want. So, you guys have any questions so far on anything?
Yeah, I've got one. On the bird's wing, that line that goes across that kind of stands out.
Mm-hmm. Uh-huh.
Is there any way to get rid of that?
No, but it won't show when you stitch it. What's going on here? I'm going to zoom in to this section, okay? Remember when I talked about when we were in those accessories and, you know, my default stitch settings, right?
Yes.
And we were in compensation, this enable overlap, that is what you're seeing here. And I'm going to go ahead and cancel out of this. And I'm going to go into, let me go zoom out so you can see everything. We're going to go into the stitch player. And let's show our shadow. Okay, remember that white setting? That's what that was. So I'm going to go ahead and let's play through this. We'll play at 100 stitches. And you know what? We're going to zoom this up a little bit. We'll go to the next color. Okay, no, all right. Okay, we'll just kind of go ahead and zoom along here. All right, so sorry, it'll take a second. I want to show you what that, you know what, we can do this a quicker way. Hold on. Let me kind of put that in the first stitching place, and then we don't have to worry about it. Okay, this is, when you're looking at this sew, okay, see where, you know, there's your underlay, right?
Right.
Okay, now watch what this does. It's going to go to this a certain point where that overlap is, and then it's going to go to the other side. It'll stop and go to the other side, begin sewing in. Maybe not because I moved, yeah, there it goes. Okay, so where this joins is where that line is, you know, showing on the display, right? And that's that overlap. See how it overlaps in there? Okay, that, it ends up represented here. You can see it kind of here and here as well, right? But it won't actually show in your stitching.
Okay. Then another question is, I have a pattern that has a line like that does show when I sew it out. Does that mean that the overlay is not overlapping?
Is it one that you made in Generations?
No, it's one I bought.
Oh, no, if it weren't overlapping, right?
Right.
Then you would have a gap. And because what happens when it sews like that is, you know, it generally kind of pushes the fabric evenly in. But if you had like terry cloth or something, you would notice the gap if you did not have that overlap.
Okay.
And when you have something that shows like that in a design, that's just an issue with whatever programs they used. Like
So
when they
no way
made
to
the
fix it?
design. You could go in, you could bring the program into, or you could bring the design into Generations if you wanted to, and you could unlock the area and then regenerate it as a complex fill. But, you know, it depends on what the fill is, how much, if it changes anything, or if it just looks at it and says, oh, yeah, it's a complex fill, okay, we'll just recalculate it. You could try that. Okay. Like when we were talking about these little lock things here, when you open up a design that's already done, everything will be locked.
Right.
So if you unlock it, then you can kind of click on the area, but you're going to have to look and see. It might break it up. It might not see it as a whole thing, right?
Right.
And you could come down here and say, you know what, let's just make this the complex fill. And see, I've got two of those sections here. And, generally they do not show in the stitching. They shouldn't. The programs that, should overlap properly so that they don't.
Yeah.
So, but, so,
sometimes you can change the in and out, and it'll go away. If you move your
right, like,
in and out points,
right, the display will go away. But, if you've got, like, I've got a complicated area here, right? Because I've got a hole. There's a hole right here. So, it's going to, it's going to have to deal with those.
Wing.
Yeah, on the wing it's easy enough. I could probably move it, but and this isn't going to be too big of a deal. But it's an odd shape too when you really look at it. The program's looking at it saying, this is kind of an odd shape, right? And so it's still going to have that overlap. I could try something like this and like this. So that it kind of stitches almost evenly from one thing to the other, right?
Okay.
And get rid of that. But, for the most part, it shouldn't show.
Yeah. Well, it does.
Sometimes that depends on the fabric. If you're having a fabric that is stretchy, where that demarcation line is, it will show, especially if you haven't used a stabilizer that is an iron-on. But I have even used an iron-on stabilizer, and the denim fabric, that mark will show simply because the fabric has stretched in the hoop.
Okay.
Yeah, but she's talking about it's not showing the fabric underneath. The stitches are noticeably different, correct?
It is showing the fabric underneath.
Oh, yeah, then they didn't use overlap. I thought you meant the stitches were showing like this. Like that odd little line.
Yeah.
Yeah, the fabric's showing underneath.
It was wide enough that it showed the fabric underneath.
Yeah, they didn't use enough overlap. What kind of fabric were you stitching on?
Sweatshirt material.
Yeah. What you can do to stop that is you can bring the design in here and you can put a global underlay underneath it. And that'll stitch it all together. You can use like an iron-on the back of that sweatshirt. Did you hoop the sweatshirt material?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
I had a tearaway stabilizer underneath it, and then I put it over the hoop and I stitched around the hoop.
Okay, so you could, if you want to use, you really shouldn't use the tearaway probably on sweatshirt. You should use a cutaway.
Okay.
And then depending on how many stitches are in the design, would determine if you needed like a layer of tearaway, and a layer of cutaway, or a heavy cutaway. Or you could. Do you have no-show poly mesh?
Yes.
Do you have like no-show? If you do 2 to 3 layers of no-show poly mesh, put them at 90-degree angles to each other.
Okay.
And that should give you enough support. And
okay.
But one layer of no-show mesh won't do it.
Okay.
So I'm sorry, I thought you meant that those stitches were actually showing on the stitch out.
It is. That's the item that I was making was red, and I put it on a black sweatshirt, so you could see the black line. You could see it. The line was black then because you could see the black material.
You could see the fabric.
Yes.
Yeah, the other thing that you can try is Hoop-It-All, the non-stick Hoop-It-All cover-up, like dry cover-up is what it's called. And it's a plastic sheet, and you can get it in red to match the color of your embroidery, right?
Okay.
And that'll hide that darker black underneath it.
Oh, okay.
And it's plastic, so once it stitches, you generally can tear it away really clean, away from the area.
Okay. And what was that called again?
And it's called dry cover-up. And the company, I think the company, if you do a Hoop-It-All dry cover-up, you should find it, although the company might have changed names.
Okay.
But the dry cover-up is great for, like sweatshirts, like if you're doing white cinnamon on a black shirt or something, right?
Yes.
But it's also great for terry toweling or anything with a pile. We usually use like wash away. They say, oh, we'll use a layer of wash away. But the problem is then it washes away, right?
Right.
Where dry cover-up stays forever.
Okay.
And so that'll keep, like if you monogram a bath towel, it will keep the pokies from coming through that wash after wash.
Okay. I'll look for that and get some.
Yeah, they sell it on rolls and they sell it in sheets.
Okay.
You can lay tulle over bath towels. Your bridal tulle.
Uh-huh.
And that will keep it. What I do is put the wash away film over first, then lay the tulle on, so that after it's embroidered, I can cut that tulle away without cutting the loops on the towel. That's what the film will keep it doing. And then you can just tear that off.
Right. And see, the dry cover-up's made, the difference is the dry cover-up's made so that it's just one layer and it tears away cleanly from the stitching.
Right.
And that's so, but, I've used dry cover-up on towels that it outlived the towel.
Yeah.
And so, but don't get the sticky one, because the sticky backed cover-up will pull your terry loops out when you try to get rid of it. The dry cover-up's just phenomenal. But all right, ladies, you guys have any other questions?
No, not really.
You guys are good, Fran? No questions?
On the auto save, did you say not to go below 5 minutes?
Yep, don't go below 5 minutes.
The preferences. Okay.
What happens is every 5 minutes it's going to save. And if you happen to have like 3 designs open, it's going to save all 3 of them. So it's automatically tying up resources even if it's saving 1 design, right? So if you're in the middle of, punching an area or generating an area and that autosave kicks, most of the time it just goes through that process and you don't really notice it, right? But every once in a while, it just hits it at the right time, like when you're generating the whole design, and there's a little bit of a drag and the potential to lock up. So, autosave every 5 minutes is a good idea. I'm sorry?
I had mine set on 3.
Yeah, 5 is good. What I got into the habit of doing was anytime I did some very serious editing, even before I generated it, I would save that section. I would just save it and then generate. Yeah. Because it just made you a little nervous sometimes, especially if you did some serious editing, right? Okay, now, before we go, some other things to look at, like on the film strip, right? Because the film strip actually is pretty powerful. You've got these settings. There's this little arrow here, and I could come in here and I could select all the invisible, may have forgotten to turn it back on, right? I could select all lines, all areas, or all locked. Okay, and that's what that little arrow. You know, this little thing here lets me come in here and say, you know, user defined, in point, out point, you know, that kind of thing, right? Like, hold on, let me go ahead and I'm going to generate real quick. And I'm going to go ahead and, I think these are, yeah, user defined, in point, out point. Okay, so I can come up here and I can say, click on this, and I can, you know, for anything that's selected, I can say, you know what, I don't want it to be user defined. I want the program to do it so that there's, you know, the running stitches and travel stitches are recalculated if necessary. And I can turn those things off very quickly. I can also, you know, use the lock icon here, or I can use the lock icon on, you know, each individual piece, and I can lock that area so that no further editing can be done on it. I can't change the color, I can't, you know, it locks it and keeps it safe from me. So if you've done some serious editing on something, you may want to lock it. And, you know, I can't change anything when I lock. See how even moving, you know, things, it just really, it's not going to let me do anything. I guess it does let me move the in and out points now, which it should not. Locked is locked, right? But anyway, so it won't let me change direction. It should not let me change color either. Okay. I'm sorry?
You can't change size.
Yeah, I shouldn't be able to change the color either. So I have a whole bunch of things going in my little note off to them.
I've always been able
I'm sorry?
I've always been able to change the color on a locked item, but never the size.
You should not be able to change anything on a locked item.
Yeah, but I've always been able to do color.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it should be locked in, but it does keep you from, like, I can't go in and edit this, you know, on accident, right? Like when I go here and it's locked, you know, I can't, okay, I should not be able to do any of this, not just that way. It should be, you know, you can see it didn't really actually let me do it, okay? It let me move those nodes, but it didn't actually do it, okay? See? Now, if I unlock this, that will go into effect, okay? So the locked item, if you've done a lot of editing, and the reason why that kind of comes in handy is this. If I am in edit mode, you know, sometimes when, you know, this would be pretty easy to pick out, right? But sometimes you might think you have something, like you might look at this and think you're editing, you know, the wing, right? When in fact you're editing, you know, something you've already edited, right? So, you know, those get to be, you know, pretty, let me go back here, see if I can get rid of those little nodes first, because it'll make more sense when I show it to you like this. Okay, so if I'm in outline mode and I happen to be in node editing, you know, see what that looks like and that looks like? This doesn't change at all, right? So if you've done something that's real close together and you've edited an area and done everything you want to it, and you happen to go to the next area, you may very well be looking at these nodes thinking there's something else. So if you lock the area, then you know for sure, even if you move stuff, that it's not actually going to change it. But don't lock the area until you're completely done. And that, because anything you may have mistakenly done to it, like you see here, will go into effect. Okay, also on the stitch, you know, sequence viewer here, you know, you've got the icons here and here. You know, that turns it invisible if you're not in 3D view. This locks it so you can't edit it. This is your color change. If you click on that in between colors like this, then you remove a color stop. If you click on it in between colors that are the same, you can insert a new color. The same thing with the trim. If you're working on a commercial machine, you can put a trim in or a color stop. And what the color stop does is literally, there's already a stop here, but I can put a stop in between here. And on my screen, it may not show me, you know, the color stop, but on your machine, that will indeed stop. So if you want to do a manually, you know, like a manually punched applique, you can put a stop in, and your machine will see those. Let me make a new file real quick. And I'm just going to go like this. And let's create an outline from the area edges. I'm just going to do a run stitch because, you know, we're making like a little applique, right? All right, so this is what I've got. And I'm going to copy and paste that and paste it one more time and change this to, nope, sorry. I'm going to change that to satin stitching. Hold on. Okay, so now we've got like our faux applique here, right? Placement, tack down, cover stitch. Well, you know, if I come in here and say stop and stop, on my screen, these are all the same. But what my machine will see is, okay, this color stop, this will be a different color, and then this will be a third color. So I can make the machine stop without having to, you know, make this, you know, yellow or pink or, you know, it's in effect doing the same thing, but, you know, it's a little quicker way to do it. And visually for you on the screen, it makes a little more sense sometimes. So any questions on that at all? Okay, now if you know, during the webinar, I was doing things like I was coming over here and I would right-click on this, and I could move to the top, move to the bottom, move to a specific number. I could move it to, and it's the number before. Like if I want to move this to cell 7, then I need to move this to before index. What that means is, you know, I want to move it to before 7, then it'll be at 7. So there you go. It now becomes, you know, before this piece, right? And the reason it's like that is if I move that to 7, it does exactly what this is. If it says move to block 7, well, you know, because that was above it, you know, technically it becomes block 6. I hope that makes sense. But, you know, down here, if I say, you know what, let's move this to block 7, then it's a little bit different coming from below. Okay, so those are the move to options. Or I can always just left click and drag it to where I want it to be. You have to kind of left click to select it and then press and hold and left click to drag it. The other options are properties. Okay, it's visible. It's not locked. Stop first, you know, that means it's, you know, there's a stop. See, I put that stop in. I could always say, you know, don't stop. User-defined endpoint, user-defined out point, or user-defined trim. User-defined trim would be if I clicked on that scissor. But I can also put it in here, and I can define these in and out points. Or I can say, click, click, they're user-defined, leave them alone. What that means is that it won't change those in and out points unless I manually move them. So if I'm auto-generating, the program automatically moves those in and out points, right, as I make things. If I tell it not to, it will not. I will have complete control over where those in and out points are. I will also have to pay attention and make sure that my jump stitches are reasonable or that I've made my own travel stitches. Do you guys have any questions on that?
No.
You're good? Okay. So those are kind of like the basics. And, yeah, those are the basics on some of the tools. And real quick, because we're almost hitting 10 o'clock now, so let me close this one. And we'll look at a couple of other things real quick. Okay, you guys understand these editing tools, right? Up in here?
Yes.
These two.
Yes.
Okay, and you know we
Real
played with
quick,
this before you got here.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
You put a stop between those, between the tack down and all. When you do the automatically done applique with generation, it puts them all in one block. Do they have stops between them?
Right.
They do. Okay. I never have.
They do.
They really work just like what you got there.
They should. And I'm going to put it that way. Because what happens, they should. But what happens is, here's the applique. So if I apply it, right, boom, boom, boom. Technically, they have stops. But I'm going to get rid of these pieces. And let's export this to, we'll just save it as, I'm trying to figure out where we are here. Just save it right here. Testing 1, 2, 3. How's that? Testing. So now, you know, that is in PEZ format. So I'm going to go ahead and open this, and I'm going to say File. You know what? Import, and we'll go to the Import 3, and I'm looking for PEZ because I believe that's what we picked, and then it was called Testing. So I'll just type it. There we are. Okay. So I'm going to open this up, and there. Boom, boom, and boom. There's my color stop, see? See the 3 colors? So, and I say in theory.
There it is.
Okay, I say in theory, right? Here's the 3 pieces. Here's my first piece, you know, and you can see it's blue, and then gray, and then the lighter blue, right? So, and I say in theory because of this. Most of the machines should see those as color stops. However, some of the export formats or the way the machine or software sees it might not see it. So always double check, you know, just in case. I very rarely use the automatic applique. I almost always manually punch it because I have more control, basically. But you know, just double check on these, you know, and make sure. For the most part, it should work. However, there have been other programs that have the automatic applique as well, and sometimes they just don't work. And it has nothing to do with the program. It has to do with how the machine sees it and stuff. And it has to do with that stop command. So, okay, real quick. What we were talking about beforehand, Shirley, is let me zoom in here real quick. I think before you came in was, this is your outline edit tool. If I select this, I'm going to unlock it and tell it that it's a satin stitch. Okay, so if I'm in this is outline view. I can edit the shape of this, right? If I'm in this, that has to do with satin stitching, I can edit the way the stitch direction goes, right?
Right.
When I get to here, this is my stitch view. However, there is one more editing option that I have, and that is this needle penetration view. Needle penetration shows me all these little dots. And, you know, it doesn't really do anything but show me these little dots until I select edit mode. Then those little dots, when this area is selected, with the edit, the hand option, I can pick these little pieces and I can pull them out. If I've got like this little troublesome stitch like in a corner, I could actually delete this.
Okay.
And you can see I just can keep deleting a section, right?
Right.
If I hold that, it'll, you know, just delete a whole section. However, as soon as I use this, that area becomes locked. Okay? Now, for designs that, you know, like this design that we just imported, right? File, import, testing. Okay, this is in stitch mode. So if I have me get rid of this one. If I have something like this, I bring it in and I want to combine it. Like maybe I want to take all of these. I'm going to double applique this, and let's make this one pink, right? So, I have these pieces. I'm going to have to do it this way. Hold on. I'm just going to move this over and bump these two off. Okay. Okay, so I have this overlap here, right? Well, if this is, a design that I purchased and, I want to overlap some things, I've got this area right here that's going to show underneath my applique fabric, right? So what I could do is I could come in here and I could zoom into the area. I could hide this piece and go out of 3D view so it's out of my way, or I could leave it on. It doesn't really make too much of a difference. But let's zoom in real close in here. You could use your edit mode and the needle penetration. Make sure you select the one you want to get rid of, and then click on one of these and begin to delete and see what direction it's going. And if it's going the right direction, just keep going, right? And let me zoom out a little bit. And you could very, very, very quickly get rid of a big section. There, now I would not have that, bump underneath. I have a jump stitch, but big whoop, who cares, right? I've gotten rid of something very quickly. I can also, with this edit mode selected, I can kind of zoom around and select stitches as well. So, I could, come in like in that one section, I could come in and go like that, but I have to be very careful because if I'm catching all of the stitches, even on the areas that aren't selected, right? Selecting this makes no difference when I'm dragging around it. See how those are all selected? But, I could come in and quickly grab something like this and, grab it and delete it. Okay? So that's one more editing view that you can use depending on, what you're doing. You can use it in a pre-made design to get rid of overlapping areas, or you can use it in a design that you've made to just pull stitches out to, maybe make like a fur effect. Okay, now this tool and this tool works with this tool right here, insert stitches. If I come over here and I click on one of these little nodes and I click on insert stitches, I automatically can insert stitches. Now these have no stitch length other than what I define. So I could go like this and just make stitches randomly on the outside, right? Or if you have something like the problem that you were talking about, I could come in and select this and I could say, let's insert some stitches. And as long as I'm careful to watch the stitch length, I can kind of fill in an area. It's not going to be perfect, but, I could fill it in. You just aren't going to want to do this for this big extended area. You're just going to want to do it for a little area. Okay? So, and I can do this for, you can see I've got that little line right there still, but I can do this for, enhancing things or correcting little bobbles or errors in a design. It's just, like on yours, it would fill in that line possibly. So that's what this needle penetration and the little hand it does. You guys have any questions on that at all? You guys are good?
You explained it very well.
Okay, so, thank you. But, okay, so we're pretty much done with the basic tools. So what we're going to start doing next time is we're going to start playing with all of the manual punch tools over here. How many of you guys have the monogramming now?
I have it.
That if you upgraded to the newest version, you have that monogram module.
Yep.
Okay, because we're going to look at, what we're looking at next time is these tools here and what you can do with them. Okay, and then we'll play with making our own, I'll put it this way, who doesn't have the monogram module?
I don't, because I haven't upgraded.
Okay, then we'll do this and we'll make, we're going to use these tools to make something. So we can do like a building block instead. Okay, so the next time we're going to start playing with the punching tools over here, and my mouse keeps disappearing, the punching tools over here, and then these quick little tools down here. Okay, and we'll make some little building blocks real quick that we can kind of save, just to go through kind of the save portions of the program. And then we'll play with some of the stitch settings as well, like the motifs and the patterns and how to set those patterns and what they do. And, and different things like that. Because if you've noticed if you've played with the program at all, just going to grab this real quick. If you played with the program at all, then you know that you've got the opportunity to make your own stitch types in your settings, right? So almost every one of these is going to let you do something to it. Okay, like in your radial setting, you can use a pattern, or, you could go in here and select the pattern and end up making your own pattern, right? There's also gradient shading, and then there's fringe effects or feathered effects that are really quite cool that can be applied to almost every stitch type. So we're going to start playing with those and making a couple of, our own little building blocks and saving those things. And we'll save a motif, and, we'll save those types of things in the next 2 webinars, right? And that'll give us a pretty good basis for what's going on. We'll go through some compensation things and how to deal with some of the built-in problems with, I shouldn't say problems, things you have to watch out for on motifs, things you have to watch out for when you're using the radial fill, or when you're using contour, or when you're using, the arc fill. And we'll talk about what the stitch shortening does, and, what the percentages are as well. Just remind me about that, because the stitch shortening is kind of interesting. It's an industrial feature, and that, while most programs give you the option to stitch shorten automatically, this one will give you a little bit more control, and I'll explain what it's actually used for. So, all right, ladies, you'll get a link from the webinar on the recording, and I'm going to go ahead and stop recording now.
Okay.
And I think